the biggest thing is making sure that the LLM itself doesn't have the power to inject code into your business logic, right? So if the users can craft and manipulate some of the prompts and the outputs of any prompts that they pass through these third parties, then there's risk for opening that up into malicious ways, right? So imagine you're a product that maybe generates a database query off of a prompt that is then fed to a model, right? Making sure that you have some of the proper controls from an authorization standpoint to ensure that the user can't do anything that they're not intended to be able to do.
Hi, I'm Mir Bagwe with the Cyber Express, and joining me today is Rohan Sathe, co-founder and CTO of Nightfall AI, who is here to discuss with us AI cybersecurity. Rohan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Rohan. Let's jump right in. As we know, artificial intelligence adoption has skyrocketed in the last couple of years, and that too across the sectors, be it manufacturing, BFSI, hospitality, or IT. But this has also attracted the eyeballs of threat actors and cybercriminals. So, my first question to you is, how do organizations approach AI threats differently as compared to traditional cybersecurity? Let's discuss it both in terms of maybe deployment and operations.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I think the way I think about it is, uh, you know, most companies are rapidly trying to transform their businesses by adopting AI technologies, right? So we've obviously seen all of the things that OpenAI has launched, and those come with different implications, right? So as you're kind of fielding user input and passing that through to a GPT like OpenAI's, you're potentially sending, sensitive content to these GPTs, or the outputs of the actual LLMs can introduce different threats to your end users, right? And so those are the things that we're seeing, just from talking with our customers and seeing some of the challenges that they're thinking through and dealing with.
Okay. So, would this approach be a little bit different, say, if you were a critical infrastructure or a government entity?
I think the biggest difference would be if you're also governed by any sort of compliance, right? So if there's any compliance that you have to abide by, then there's strict kind of privacy regulation in terms of what data can be shared with some of these models. And so I think that's probably the biggest implication. If you're working with governments or you are a government entity, there's just more that you have to go through in order to make sure that you're not oversharing any information with these third parties.
Mhm. Which industries do you see the most promising AI use cases in? And what does the current threat landscape look like for those organizations?
Yes, I think we're seeing them most commonly in sort of like customer support use cases, right? So agents that help with support experiences is one thing that we see pretty commonly. Powering natural language-based applications, speech to text, those kinds of things. And so I think the biggest threats, again, seem to be centered around governance of the data that is both being sent to models and outputted from models. So I think those are the risks that we typically see. There are kind of theoretical risks around like prompt injection and things like that folks may have read about, but we're not seeing that as sort of the most urgent risk that security and compliance professionals are looking to solve.
Okay. One more thing is that companies are also, of course, integrating LLMs into internet connected applications. So, how
Right.
do you manage the new attack surfaces that come from there?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is making sure that the LLM itself doesn't have the power to inject code into your business logic, right? So if the users can craft and manipulate some of the prompts and the outputs of any prompts that they pass through these third parties, then there's risk for opening that up into malicious ways, right? So imagine you're a product that maybe generates a database query off of a prompt that is then fed to a model, right? Making sure that you have some of the proper controls from an authorization standpoint to ensure that the user can't do anything that they're not intended to be able to do.
Mhm. So, one of the mitigation strategies usually is discussed is an AI firewall kind of sorts. No? So how does this work, and on which specific threats that you see is this more useful for?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to a lot of the things that we had talked about earlier. So, the use cases that we commonly hear security professionals being most concerned about is really around data governance first and foremost. So, as a firewall company ourselves, the idea there is to insert yourself kind of both at the beginning of a prompt being fed to a model like OpenAI and on the output side. So prior to the output actually being fed to an end user or an application, making sure that you're properly screening outputs for undesirable kind of activity. So I think data governance, where that is important on the input side is making sure that you're not sending things like customer PII or IP to some of these models, which can then, you leverage that data to retrain. And then on the output side, making sure that the outputs are really kind of contained to the spectrum that you want them to be contained to.
Mhm. So, for companies storing LLM data in the cloud, so what kind of security considerations must they really take apart from what you've already mentioned? Is there any specific thing that large data sets actually need to be taking these? If I would just say that list down the five topmost things that you need to take into consideration for security considerations. So what would they?
Yeah, yeah, I think the first would definitely be ensuring that you actually need the data that you're storing to fine tune any of the models that you're building.
Hmm,
Um, in many cases, like you don't actually need real customer PII or sensitive data to fine tune a model. Like what you really need is a synthetic kind of equivalent of the data that you get from your customer. So I think that's kind of firstly what we see is hey, do you actually need the data that is being stored? And if not, can you obfuscate or mask it as part of training pipeline or a data pipeline where you're ingesting that data to begin with, or a labeling pipeline, right? So that's
hmm,
number one. I think number two is really around the firewall concept. So once you deploy some of these models in production, are you properly sanitizing inputs and outputs to
hmm.
ensure you're both in compliance and not introducing any security risk? So those are honestly the top two things that we see. We see some theoretical sort of concerns about prompt injection and jailbreaking and stuff like that, but less common than the top two, I would say.
So, is there a particular geography that you feel that is much more vulnerable at this point of time when it comes to these kind of prompt engineering attacks and everything?
I think in general, regulated industries tend where your application is either generating outputs of customer data or you're feeding potentially sensitive customer data to your own homegrown models or to third parties. It's typically where we see some of the most like urgent concern. Yeah, like healthcare, health tech, financial services, fintech. Those are the places where we see kind of this like urgent need to do something right away.
So I would like to put you on the spot of bother, but I'd like to know your views about compliance when it comes to LLM. So it's always been a kind of a argument going on that you need to use data that is actually useful to feed to these LLMs and get much more nuanced kind of answers coming out, outputs coming out from these LLMs. But at the same time, like you said, feeding in PII and personal information, that is not just possible. So what's your take on the compliance give and take? Like, can we have a middle ground somewhere in that? How do we mitigate this particular risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think compliance, it's there for a reason, right? I think with models, it's no different than some of the compliance you might see just using SaaS applications, right? Like just using things like Slack and Google Drive. If you're bound by some compliance, say you're in healthcare and you can't store or transmit protected health information there, then I don't see it as any different if you're using a third party LLM. And so um, to kind of go back to your question, the way we see things is from our vantage point, I think companies should be deploying things like firewalls, right, to ensure again like inputs and outputs are sanitized. And then from the standpoint of like training data, of course, your data itself needs to be representative of the types of outputs you're looking for from the model. Um, but at the same time, there's kind of a question as to whether you need the raw data itself. Like, can you generate synthetic data and get some of the same performance that you're looking for is something that is important as well.
Okay. So, along with large language models, there's also like small language models that are
Yeah.
being suggested as a potential alternative to the firms that need targeted, like small
Yeah.
scale functions. Yeah. So, can you give more details about that? Like, how does it work and how is it useful?
Yeah, I mean, I think the implication for the smaller models is, you can fine tune them a little bit more easily or retrain them. And then two, there's a performance implication too, both in terms of scalability and cost, right?
Hmm.
Cheaper to kind of deploy because they're smaller in size, and so inference costs can be lower as well, and just more performant because they're smaller. So responses can come back more quickly. So that's kind of the main implication. Of course, the con of it is like the large language model, as it's named, has a lot more context because it's just trained with a lot more data. But the smaller ones can kind of solve very specific use cases. So if your use case is very specific and you want to fine tune something, then the smaller models tend to do quite well.
So, if I am, say, mid-sized company,
Yeah.
which is serving around, say, 100 customers. So, what do you think would work well for me? A small language model or a large language model? And what are the kind of, considerations, business considerations that I would have to make while making those choices?
Yeah, it's really going to depend on the use case and kind of the product functionality that you're offering with the AI. I think yeah,
Maybe
just
if you just take into consideration, I am a SaaS application provider, which
yeah,
is providing probably a healthcare kind of an, like you say, EMR
yeah.
software. So, what would work for me the best?
Yeah, so it's an EMR, and let's say you're answering questions about your medical records or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, Typically, like again, like there's no one size kind of fits all here, but I think typically as a smaller company, you care a lot about cost, right? Because you don't want to bloat your sort of your cloud compute costs, and so um, I think if it's a very specific thing, like in healthcare, you can probably get away with fine tuning a smaller model and get some of the performance that you need. If you have more of a general kind of the spectrum, the range of like the types of questions that may be asked and the types of outputs that may be returned is broad, then that's where a larger kind of language model makes a lot more sense. And I guess like so cost and performance is kind of the other big thing. If you need something that's very low latency and you're running, tens or millions of inferences per second, and you need those to come back in a very quick time period, right? Let's say between 100 to 500 milliseconds, that's where the smaller models may make more sense. For the use case you described, um, I can imagine like a few seconds of delay is probably not too problematic. So, again, it's going to come down probably more to cost and just like performance of the
Mhm.
questions being asked. Yeah.
Okay. So I would just like to ask you about the strategies that you would use to identify and mitigate the bias in large language models, because this is one thing that has been talked about so extensively. That's the bias of LLMs. So what would be those strategies involved?
Yeah, I think it comes down to kind of figuring out what problem you're trying to solve and crafting a data set that you can
Mhm.
fine tune a model off of. So those are, some of the things that I can think of off of the top of my head. Fine tuning with kind of a curated data set
Mhm.
to ensure it's really solving the problem that you want it to solve.
Okay. So have you faced a situation where you had to address, ethical concerns in an AI project? And what kind of steps did you take to ensure ethical integrity?
Yeah, I think for our use case, since it's a little bit more security focused, that tends to not be something that is top of mind because our like if you are serving a customer facing application, that's where I think like if you're answering questions or things like that's where it's a little bit more important for the to make sure that the model is actually not being biased or responding in a way that can be detrimental to your brand or reputation. For us, like in our product, the output is not so much a hey,
Hmm.
this is you asked a question and this is the thing we answered. It's very binary. It's like, hey, you sent us some data and we tried to find something sensitive in it and we did or did not find something sensitive and here's where we found it. So a little bit different of a use. Yeah.
Yeah, so because you were talking about, privacy and security is the basis and core of your product.
Yeah.
So how do you ensure the privacy of user data when training and deploying a large language model? That is something I think our viewers would also like to know about.
Yeah, it's a lot of the stuff that we had talked about earlier. So mostly around like generating synthetic data. So we don't actually need like raw PII or customer data to create one of our models. We can generate synthetic data off of example data sets. These days, there's a bunch of publicly available data too that you can kind of bootstrap a data set with. But those are the two ways we kind of ensure strict data security and privacy in our own data sets. And the other is like our customers have the ability to completely opt out of us leveraging any of their data to train our models. So if they decide to opt out, then we don't store any of their data. But the consequence of that is like if they have something that they want to gear more specifically to their industry or their company, then of course that they're going to have to leverage kind of the general purpose models that we have. So
Mhm. So, have you faced any challenges of model drift in LLMs? It's something that has just popped out of nowhere. So, have you faced something of that sort?
not so much. I think again, like we're we're pretty careful with the types of like use cases we support with the language models that we have in production and the way we kind of craft and curate our data sets to make sure
Hmm.
we stay very focused on solving that use case. So that's kind of the way we think about it.
Okay. Okay. So, coming towards the adversarial attacks and everything. So, what are the adversarial attacks in context of LLMs, and how can they impact the performance and reliability of these models?
Yeah, I think I mean prompt injection is kind of one, right, where you're trying to carefully craft prompts to get undesirable kind of outputs from
Mhm.
models, right? We we kind of see those as a little bit more theoretical because again, like our application specifically, we're not the user doesn't really have necessary control over kind of what's being fed to the models. Like we're able to sanitize some of the inputs and
Mhm.
make sure that it's asking a very directed question.
Mhm.
But I think if you have kind of a product where the user input is very open-ended, then that's where that there's potential for a kind of abuse. But again, like we've kind of seen it as more theoretical than like real attacks in industry that have actually caused, major data breaches, for example. So
Okay. So since we are talking about your product, I would like to know, like, Nightfall AI is in the business of cloud data loss prevention, right? For generative AI tools. So what does that include, and how it is making a difference to the society?
yeah, so at its core, we enable businesses that are looking to transform their products with AI to really think about data security. And we do that across any of the kind of threat vectors. So that's across all of their SaaS applications that they may be leveraging, generative AI, endpoints, email. And so we cover kind of these privacy and compliance and security issues that are the result of either careless behavior from your end users or malicious behavior from your end users where they're trying to steal data out of your application. So we've taken that technology and said, hey, like the same technology that can be applied to looking for sensitive data in SaaS applications, we can use that as a firewall in front of generative AI applications. And so at its core, what we do is just build models that are really good at data classification across different content types. So it's not just limited to text, but also images, for example, or PDF. Some of the things that you're seeing in GPT-4, right, where they're accepting different types of input. And so providing that as a product so that folks can instrument both in the inputs and on the output layer to ensure that they stay compliant with any regulation that they have to abide by. So.
Excellent. So, can you provide a case study of how you've implemented in one of your customer environment about this?
Yeah, yeah. So we have a big food delivery customer of ours that basically leverages a third-party LLM to power their customer support experience. And because they're a global company, they're kind of governed by different privacy regulation, and they want to ensure that even though they've signed an enterprise license with OpenAI, that they're not sending sensitive data to them, right? And so the mechanism in which they do that is they leverage a firewall product to sanitize both the inputs and the outputs of the model so that they stay compliant.
So the integrity remains, and so what are the vectors that you kind of gauge that this is your product is helping your customers, or how do your customers actually know and can gauge the fact that yes, your Nightfall AI's product is actually helping them out in solving a few questions.
Yeah, so if we're looking to protect their SaaS applications, then they get the security teams themselves get direct feedback on the types of things that we find and the risks that we protect against. And so they can mark things as false positives. For example, if our models are incorrectly identifying sensitive data or obfuscating it incorrectly. And then for the kind of like product AI firewall use case, usually our customers will sample inputs. So they'll do some testing ahead of deploying our thing in production to ensure that the accuracy kind of meets some of their needs. And then they'll continuously kind of sample inputs and outputs from Nightfall to ensure that it's kind of meeting their standard. And then obviously like their customers will also kind of write into support if they see things not working exactly how they wanted it to work, and so then that can be fed to us as feedback as well. So
Perfect. So I think we've covered a lot of topics over here, talking about LLMs and everything. So if I have to, before going, if I have to ask you, these are the three, give me just three points for LLM mitigations. What would those be for me and for our viewers to consider?
so yes, I think number one for sure, data governance and compliance, ensuring that you indeed should be sending the type of data that your product may be to these models. So thinking of kind of a strategy both on the model consumption side with an AI firewall, and on the training side, right? And ensuring that you're kind of redacting and obfuscating data. The second would be around synthetic data. So it's like back to kind of, do you actually need to train or fine tune a model with raw customer data, or can you generate synthetic data off of it and then discard it once you've generated the synthetic data? Um, and then three, I think just continue to stay abreast of some of the research around some of these attacks like prompt injection. Like, are these things really advancing into things that are more than just theoretical? And are we starting to see like real attacks in industry where companies have been breached or infiltrated basically based on something that was the result of an input or output? So,
Excellent. So just one last question before we go.
yeah.
Since we've spoken about compliance and governance about LLMs, I would just like to know your take on obviously LLMs are not something that one size fits all. So do you think that the governance on a global level for one size fits all again? Is that possible for having governance over LLMs?
I think the types of PII that and sensitive content people typically tend to look out for generalizes quite well. So like, what is sensitive financial data to one company typically translates to the majority of, financial companies, for example. So in general, those things actually generalize actually really well.
So
Um,
maybe in terms of sectors, we can have compliance and governance.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I think in terms of sectors and content types within those sectors that companies are more likely to be concerned with, you know, a one size fits all type of approach to identifying and obfuscating that information tends to work quite well. If you have something very specific to your business or unique to your business, that's where, you're looking at sort of fine tuning an approach or crafting something very specific to that problem. But um, most of these kind of compliance regulations call out like very general types of information that is just deemed, PII for everyone. So
Mhm. Excellent, Rohan. It was lovely talking to you. In fact, I got a lot of inputs related to a lot of questions that I had in my mind. I've been covering AI and cybersecurity for a long time, but the confluence between the two, that's something that is actually catching the eyeballs of people right now. And the conversation with you really helped me gain more insights into that and resolving those questions that I had in my head going on. So thank you so much, Rohan, for giving me that, giving me and our viewers those insights related to AI and cybersecurity. Thank you
yeah,
so much.
thanks so much for having me here. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you, Rohan. This was Rohan with us, and this is your Mir Bagwe for the Cyber Express signing off. Thank you so much.